Let's begin with a short prayer. Father, we ask your blessing on the people who are caring for one another, people who bring groceries to people who are in their homes, people who call and try and encourage people, all the people that make this process possible, particularly for really elderly people who can be terribly isolated. We ask this in the name of Jesus, the Lord. Okay. We talked about the expanse of the Muslims in Spain. There was a very small kingdom in the north of Spain called Asturias. Asturias was independent of the Muslims. It was never taken over by them at all. And they began a very slow process of retaking Spain from the Muslims. The nature of this process was that the Spanish, I don't know whether they were under any obligation by the Muslims. Sometimes when the Muslims took over an area, they forced them to become Muslim. Oftentimes when they overtook an area, they did not do that at all. So I don't know what was going on in Spain, but I do know the bulk of the population had retained Christianity. And so this community, as they would move into an area, would sort of agitate a whole group of the area and liberate little tiny pieces at a time. And this took centuries, actually. And one of the things that happened was in the process, the church in that area was completely changed because the church structure, customs, and life in Spain then became very influenced by Rome. Remember, we started out earlier talking about these different systems all over, but right now, Spain in this process, as it's reconquered, becomes patterned after the Latin Church in Rome. The civil life, however, was patterned after France, which I think you know borders Spain, and they were very impressed by the government over there in France. In the year 827, the Muslim forces began to take Sicily, and it became a center of trade for the whole of the Mediterranean. Palermo was made the Muslim capital, and for a very long time was the most magnificent city in all of Europe. Again, the Muslims who went into Palermo did not force the Christians to convert. And because of where Palermo is, because of where Sicily is, it became a center of the mixing of cultures all around the Mediterranean, a very, very rich culture. It became a very important place for Muslim ideas to enter Europe. Europeans could go to Sicily and kind of feel they were in Europe, even though it was a Muslim society, and then go back and carry the ideas and things they learned into Europe. And for anyone who has done any kind of travel, I would say, this is a personal opinion, that today Palermo is perhaps the city in the entire world which best exemplifies the very best of diverse cultures, customs, celebrations, and food. It's an amazing thing, the way these are mixed, and architecture as well. In the year 850, the Vikings began terrifying raids on Western Europe. The first raid actually was not identified as having taken place till about 50 years ago. There was a remote monastery near the coast in Britain. And one day, some pilgrims went to the monastery and found all the monks had been killed and the monastery had been looted. About 50 years ago, when they were doing research in Denmark, they found a Viking grave. When they opened the grave, they found in it a silver chalice, which is known to have been recorded to have been in that monastery. This proved that the Vikings were the ones that entered Europe that time, took the monastery, and killed the monks. Monasteries were particularly vulnerable because they tended to be remote. And one of the things that the Vikings were after, and I'm not really sure the reason for this either, but the Vikings really craved silver above everything. They wanted silver. And there was a lot of that in the monasteries in the forms of chalices, candlesticks, all kinds of things. So the monasteries became a particular target of the Muslims throughout Europe. There were 3 separate English kingdoms that fell individually to the Muslims. There was a 4th kingdom, however, under a man we know as Alfred the Great. And he fought off the Vikings. And realizing that we were talking with the Vikings, a very different religion than the Christian religion, he began a renewal of the Christian religion in his area in an effort to try and keep the Vikings out of the area. And this began a powerful renewal of culture against the Muslims. One of the things that he did that was very unusual at the time, he began taking theological writings and began translating them into Anglo-Saxon, which was the native language. At that time, it's kind of a hard thing to understand, and we'll see more of this. When schools opened, non-priests and non-monks were forbidden to study theology. And everything in the monasteries and the schools initially was all taught in Latin. So you had to study in Latin. And the great works were somehow perpetuated in Latin and not in other languages. And as a result of that, education was very much the business of the church. Alfred defeated a man by the name of Guthrum, and he was one of the Viking kings. But he accepted the defeat, and as part of the defeat, he chose to be baptized. One of the things that I think we think very differently about today, but in the ancient world, this whole idea of gods was a very complex thing. And there were local gods to cities, local gods to areas. People had their own local god. And if you went to battle against another country that had a different god, and you were defeated, the concept was that their god was more powerful than your god. So very often people would change religions that way. The same thing, if you read the Exodus, you'll find out that part of the text you see as the Jews are going through the process of Exodus is a realizing that their God is more important than the gods of Egypt. And they'll speak of him as the God of gods, Lord of lords, King of kings. But they use this because they have watched their God defeat not just the Egyptians, but the gods of Egypt. And so this Viking king accepted, was baptized. Now the goals of Alfred were actually the same as those of Charlemagne, that he wanted to see a united, this time just England, but he wanted to see a united England with his line being the political government and the church, particularly under the Pope, being the religious government. And that was what he was hoping. He was not nearly as successful as Charlemagne. First of all, he was working in a smaller area. But again, the British Isles at this time were in terrible turmoil. And with the Vikings and the fights going on between the different little kingdoms and stuff. And so there were many different kingdoms. And what happened was the Vikings defeated little ones by their not being willing to unite. And when they defeated them, oftentimes the Vikings took over and settled in the area. It was not like going into a country and achieving a victory. When Alfred defeated this particular Viking, it was one little area, not a big deal at all. At this time, in the year 862, the emperor in Constantine found two brothers and sent them as missionaries to the Slavs. The Slavs are located north of Germany. Cyril and Methodius were very well educated and knew the Slavic language. That would be very unusual at the time. The Slavs were considered barbarians, and about the only people who were in the language would be people who were trading with them or something like that. But these two men were extremely well educated, which would mean they wouldn't be in the trading business, and they also spoke Slavic. They were very well received, and probably the most lasting effect we have for them is they created a written language for the Slavs. The Slavs did not have a written language of their own, and they created the written language. They used, largely using Roman letters. I think the letters in the Slavic language are probably more similar to the Russian language, where the R is turned another way and stuff like that. But that was the thing, and so that's been really their lasting thing. In 862, they arrived in Rome at the invitation of the Pope. The Pope invited them to come to Rome, largely because the Pope was very impressed with the speed and vigor of their conversion going on among the Slavs. The bishops in Venice, which was then a province of Constantinople, accused them of using a language that was not permitted in the liturgy. Now remember, Venice at this time was under the emperor in Constantinople. If you go to, let's say, St. Mark's Cathedral today in Venice, you'll notice it looks very Eastern Orthodox. There are icons in it, no statues, that sort of stuff. It is very, very much in the Eastern mode. And that's because at this time it was all under Constantinople, and Constantinople wanted the liturgy to be in Greek, okay? Now, these Cyril and Methodius composed the liturgy. In fact, their liturgies are still used in the churches in that area. And they composed the liturgy, and it began to be used. The Easterners did not like the Mass in Latin, and they certainly probably never even encountered it in Hebrew. But they didn't like it in Latin, but because of the role of the Pope, who was recognized really as the head of all the churches, because of the role of the Pope, they would not attack that, but they attacked the Slavics. And at that time, many people believed, honestly, that you could only pray in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And the reason they said that was, if you remember the sign on the top of the cross, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, was written in Hebrew for the Jewish nation in Jerusalem. It was written in Greek for the educated people in Roman society. It was written in Latin for the uneducated soldiers. And so they figured they were only to be used in those three languages. It is an interesting thing to watch how historically people will end up locked in a language. And there are a couple of interesting things, like if you go into the Muslim community today, you cannot have a translation of the Quran. The Quran only exists in Arabic. And if you want to get it translated and see what it would look like in English, you can buy books like that, but they will be called a commentary on the Quran. And one of the advantages of that is whenever Quranic scholars ever discuss the Quran, everyone is always working from exactly the same text wherever they are. Now, once you begin to translate, like we translated the scriptures initially, the Jews translated theirs from Hebrew to Greek. Now, when the Christian tradition began, we had already seen them translated that way. So we had no problem translating them all into Latin at the time of Jerome. And we translate, but historically, there have been some very, very serious problems when the Greek theologians, at the time the churches broke, the East and West, the Greek theologians were working from Greek texts, the Latin theologians from Latin texts, and they very often misunderstood one another. It was a source of many problems. So there are advantages in translating, in which case you get the scriptures into the hands of more people. There are advantages in not translating, because then the scholars are better able to deal with it. But anyway, this is going back and forth historically. They used this opportunity because of their conflict in Venice. they really continued on to Rome. They were on their way to Rome from the Slavic countries, but they passed through Venice on their way to Rome. And when they went through Venice, which was the Greek thing, they were very seriously condemned. But anyway, then they continued on. While they were in Rome, Cyril died. Methodius was then consecrated a bishop by the Pope. So the Pope took Methodius, the living brother, he consecrated him as a bishop, so that when he returned to the Slavs, he would have the ability to begin ordaining priests. And what they wanted to do now was they had the church sort of set up there. But one of the key things to get any church going is what we would call local vocations. Like I was a member of a religious community at one time, the Maris. And when the Maris would go in, they basically went into the South Pacific. And so they would go into Samoa, Hawaii, Tahiti. They went into these areas as missionaries. But the principal goal they had there initially was to get the local people, Samoans and this sort of thing, to become priests so that they would have basically their own church. And when you have priests from your own culture, it's much easier to function in how the culture interrelates with the church. And in missionary days, that's a problem. In the United States, it was a problem when, at the early days, the United States was divided between German clergy and Irish clergy, and very much in conflict over a long time, until gradually the country came to have more and more local clergy. I'll tell you, when I was a youngster in the Diocese of San Diego, almost every pastor was Irish. And the largest number of bishops in the United States were Irish. And that changed over a period of time. But this idea of being able to have local priests is really important. And it's officially when any diocese actually ceases to be a missionary diocese, is when it begins to produce its own clergy. Now, the rulers in France, the Frankish rulers, wanted control of the lands, the Slavic lands. They were looking at the Slavs as being, as I mentioned, uneducated and everything, and they thought they could take them over largely under the control of the Frankish lords. So to do this, the first thing they did was imprison Methodius. Finally, through the good graces of the Pope, Methodius was released. He inspired many young people, and it became a very, very powerful church, right up into almost our own day. He then returned to Constantinople, and he received a hero's welcome at that time. He died there in 885. Around the year 900, we began, there's a slight overlap, but we began a very serious change that goes on in the world. It was during this period the Frankish emperors who descended from Constantine were still around, but the empire was falling apart. And what was happening is individual areas would come under the control of individual dukes, and so, or lords of whatever kind. But the Frankish king could not alienate too many of the dukes because they could revolt against him. So he allowed them a lot of independence. And in the process of the independence, actually, the empire shredded. Pope John VIII was one of the very last powerful popes for very many years. He had to deal with three main problems in his pontificate. The growing influence of the French on the papal states. The French wanted control of the Pope, and to get control of the Pope, they thought they had to get control of the papal states. So they were exercising a lot of control there on the different people ruling the papal states. Secondly, Rome was very seriously in danger of being conquered by the Muslims at this time. The Muslims were moving more and more into Italy, taking over areas. And so he had to deal with this. And the final thing, he was involved with some serious disputes with Constantinople around language, the type of bread used in liturgy, and stuff like that. And actually, he was able to resolve this third thing in his pontificate. But that marked the end of powerful popes for a long time. Frankish and Lombard nobles got together and named his successors for the next 20 years. For 20 years, the Lombards and the Franks. The Lombards, incidentally, were basically Vikings, but these are Christian Vikings. And for 20 years, Roman nobles came to be more and more involved in the choice of a pope. They were pushing the Lombards out. And often the conflicts ended up in bloody wars, where they were having a big war over who was, in fact, to be the next pope. Dominion over the pope by noble Roman families would continue and grow for a very long period of time. In fact, if you study history, the last pope elected from noble Roman families was actually Pius XII. Now, there was many popes before whom who weren't from those families, but for a long time they all came from those families. Now, on the bright side, there were still many small courts, noble courts, and monasteries where culture continued to grow. You realize that when society begins to fragment this way, it's not very good for the society as such. However, it seems to oftentimes work very well for pockets of culture. And so these pockets of culture were working very well. The work of many bishops created great learning centers, and they were in Reims, Mainz, Salzburg, and these places became famous. Seine as the same thing, became famous all over the world. And probably this is a period when we were going through, we mentioned earlier, people who had been great historians in history upon whom we were very dependent. This came a huge flowering of interest in the whole thing of history, and the history of the church particularly. But it led to a massive publication and writing of books about history and of books about the saints. And so a lot of that went on at this time in these little pockets of monasteries and things. A very famous teacher came up at this time called John Scotus. Incidentally, Scotus simply means from Scotland. So John Scotus, he was placed in charge of the court school in Paris. Now, we mentioned that the court school in Paris, going back to Charlemagne, had been a very, very important school. It was eclipsed by some of these others around this time, but it remained a school. However, he placed this man in charge. This man was a Greek scholar. One of the really famous fathers of the church is a man known as Dionysius. One of the great fathers of the Catholic Church was a man by the name of Dionysius, and we have his works. Pseudo-Dionysius is a later man. We have no idea who he was, but he wrote under the name of Dionysius and tried to write in the style and the theology of the other Dionysius, as though this was just more of Dionysius's work. But it really wasn't. And this guy, it's too bad he didn't use his own name. He's a famous scholar in his own right today. But he was called Pseudo-Dionysius. And so he translated his books. His books were all in Greek. And he translated them into French so they could be used in Paris. He also, in Latin, he translated them into Latin so they could be used in the university in Paris. He wrote many theological books himself, and he's very important. One of the most important topics going on at the time was just how Jesus was present in the Eucharist. Notice here there's no question of Jesus being present in the Eucharist, but how was he present? And historically, there are questions like that. Is Jesus present in the bread? Does the bread cease to be and it is just Jesus? Or, all kinds of questions. So there's no question Jesus is present in the Eucharist at this time. But the question is, how? How does he maintain that presence in the Eucharist? In 829, a man by the name of Gottschalk, who was a Saxon monk, taught that everyone was destined for heaven or hell at the moment of his birth. Now, the church condemned this. It was called predestination, and the church condemned it. This would surface again at the time of the Reformation as one of the central ideas that would be taught by John Calvin. John Calvin's influence in the United States is seen largely through the Presbyterian Church. The church he started is basically called the Calvinistic Church, but the Calvinistic Church, one of the major leaders of that was John Knox, and he founded the Presbyterians in Scotland using Calvin's theology, and it's through the Presbyterians it came to our country. The teaching held that Jesus came to save only those who were predestined for heaven by the Father. The Father would decide before he created you whether he were creating you for heaven or for hell, and then he would create you. Although he was condemned, Gottschalk, and imprisoned in a monastery, one of the things he did was force the church to consider the whole interworking of the human free will and the foreknowledge of God. This becomes a very complicated issue for several times in the church until finally theologians are forbidden by Rome from debating the issue. And what it basically is God, by his foreknowledge, knows everything I do in my entire life long before I created. So if I'm going to hell and he created me, didn't he create me for hell? On the other hand, we know in our own lives that we make choices. They're free choices. God knows the choice we're going to make, but he doesn't bring it about. And he calls us into being, and we go on in this series of choices to everlasting life or not. And so the two positions very much argue. It is a very, very difficult question. How can God know how I'm going to end up without somehow having some role in it? So during this period, another very interesting thing happened was through the leadership of great bishops, the church came to be doing all the things that good government was supposed to be doing, and we increased it little by little. We built schools, we cared for the sick, we fed the hungry, we provided for the elderly, and we offered medical services. So the church was doing all these things. If you ever notice that governments oftentimes, like if you have a standard church in a country, like in Denmark, you have the Lutheran Church. The Lutheran Church is financed by the government to do these things, to found schools, medical centers, and that sort of stuff. You'd find in Spain and in Italy and many other countries, the Catholic Church was paid by the government to do this, so the government didn't do it itself. In the United States, it's kind of indirectly done that way because the government will give you tax benefits for money and stuff you give to that kind of work. But all along, this is a very expensive part of society. And so the government does not want to do it. The government doesn't think they get a lot of benefit out of it, whereas the benefit actually is happy people. But they don't think they get a lot of benefit out of it. So governments try and avoid doing this kind of thing if they can. And that's the thing with socialism. If socialism comes into a society, even limited democratic socialism, socialism begins to do this for the society. The best example of socialism in our country is Social Security. So, also at this time, any problem that a bishop might be experiencing would be brought to the attention of the Pope. And the attention was brought by archbishops. Archbishops were more in direct contact with the Pope than bishops. And bishops oftentimes were very poor and small dioceses and stuff. So anyway, they would speak to the archbishop about any difficulty they were having, and that archbishop would carry that difficulty to the Pope. So at this time, the Pope became even more powerful internationally with regards to the church And that power came through the role of the archbishops. You remember when the man became an archbishop, he went to Rome, he received the pallium, and he pledged personal loyalty to the Pope. That was part of the whole thing of being an archbishop. In 882, with the weakening of the Carolingian Empire, the Christian kingdoms, these small kingdoms, came more and more under the attack of Muslim raiders. And in the year 882, the Muslim raiders were able to burn Monte Cassino to the ground. Monte Cassino Abbey, if you remember, was founded by Benedict, had been a center of learning and culture in the church. There was very little resistance, and the Muslims established many little communities in Italy, and the only areas that were independent of the Muslim invasion were the Byzantine areas, the areas that had been set up by Constantinople. The Latin communities and the communities with regards to the Pope were all very, very vulnerable. But places like Venice and Ravenna and several places that had actually been under the control of Constantinople, they were successfully defended, but not the other areas. The area of northern Europe was never occupied by the Romans. The Romans never went up into the area. And these people, whom today we call the Vikings, became the terror of Europe. In 825, there are just some amazing things you begin to study historically, but there is a hymnal that was used all over England. And one of the prayers that was part of the prayer of the faithful, standardly, was, God deliver us from the Danes and their terrible dogs. They used to have the Great Danes fight with them. And there used to be prayers about protection from the Muslims just given everywhere. But Muslims would come in off the coast, raid a city, and they would loot the city, they'd kill people, take them off as slaves, and be gone. By the time the army had come from something else, it was all over. So they were really terrible. But in 825, Harold, a Viking king in Denmark, became very close friends of Louis the Pious, and finally he became a Catholic. Remember, Louis the Pious was the son of Charlemagne, a grandson, I think, of Charlemagne, and was one of the leaders in France. A Frankish monk by the name of Ansgar was sent to the Vikings to convert the area. We don't hear much about St. Ansgar in the Latin Catholic Church because the areas that he converted all are pretty well Lutheran now. But St. Ansgar is a very, very important saint, and you would oftentimes find churches dedicated to St. Ansgar. The Lutheran Church, for instance, in Salinas, is dedicated to St. Ansgar. And Ansgar began a very, very long and slow process. But in the process, the Vikings were converting. There was a great show on TV, I don't know if it's still on, called The Vikings. And it's the story of a Viking village and how they began to raid Europe and everything, and how they take a priest as a slave. And they, over a period of time, they have high respect for him because he was a wise man and deeply religious and everything. And they come to see him more and more as an equal in their society. But you watch their slow move to conversion. It's a very slow thing. The Vikings did not have a lot of respect for Christians because they regarded them as weak. And so they did not have a lot of respect for them. At the beginning of the 10th century, civil and religious unity through Europe and the rest of the world could only be a dream. And ties with the emperor and the pope were weak. Power was in the hands of local lords, who were often in control of the church as well. So in the area, the church would be controlled by the lord as well as the lands. In the year 936, the revival of imperial Rome began. It began with a king in Germany who was known by the name of Otto I. He wanted to be a strong emperor, but understood that one of the keys to actually taking the title emperor and be considered head of the Roman Empire was that you needed to be crowned by the Pope. That because of what happened with Charlemagne and things like that, this idea of being crowned by the Pope was crucial to the idea of being an emperor. So he began a path to do that. He became a very strong supporter of the church against local nobles, and because he was doing that, the church supported him against the nobles as well. And he gradually, little by little, took over the nobles and basically had control of the land. You remember that when you have civil authority, even a weak civil authority, as you had in Otto, it had some authority over people. And when you had church authority, which was pretty weak too, because the lords were fought. But when these two are united, you're actually getting unity from two directions. And it is a very powerful movement when it occurs in history. I think you know that because of the nature of civil government, more often than not, the church finds itself in conflict with civil government because it must challenge civil government. And so civil government oftentimes sees the enemy as a church, sees the church as an enemy. In the year 955, Otto I defeated the Hungarians, and in the process, he won the support of the German princes. The Hungarians had largely had tribes come in and they were very vicious and used to have wars raid into Germany. Germany was never conquered by them, but they were a constant problem. But when Otto conquered them, the threat of the Hungarians against the German princes was over. And so they began a strong support of Otto for their benefit. Pope John XII asked and received the emperor's support against the Roman nobles. So he's sort of conquered the German nobles, and now the Pope calls him to come in and do the same with the Roman nobles, which he does. Otto occupied Italy and declared himself the King of Italy as well as his emperor in Germany. And in 962, the Pope crowned Otto as the Holy Roman Emperor. And the idea of this Holy Roman Empire was reborn, although in this time it was little more than Germany, the land little more than Germany itself. The following years would see strong popes and strong emperors, and they would often be in conflict with one another. That's the problem with strong leaders. So that if you were to take a Catholic country, and let's say you have a Catholic emperor and the Pope, and there would always be conflicts between them, between the emperor seeing the Pope as interfering, like you can't have wars on holy days and stuff like that. The Pope would be seen as interfering in what they clearly regarded as a civil thing, and the Pope would see the government interfering when it would limit the type of social work, like you could have hospitals for our people during a war, but not for the enemy. You need to be very careful in the distribution of food, that we get it first, and I mean, just all kinds of things. So these two things oftentimes are at war with one another in the best of situations. The thing is, the value of having the government and the church working in tandem is catastrophic. So to the degree they can get that, everyone loves it, and they make a lot of compromise. And if you look at the foundation of the United States, that was one of the things that really was a part of it. And that's largely because the gentlemen who founded this country were deists. They believed in God, but not any particular religion, really. So in our tradition, we have many, many different religions preaching God, and we have a government. And the government is supposed to respect God, and religion, works with the government. But you notice, just like I mentioned about the wars, holy days, what soldiers do when they fight, how that works, is actually under the civil government. However, the civil government makes sure that there are clergy available to soldiers wherever they go. So there's these things that they work together. Otto managed to have his personal tutor named the next pope. The Germans had become fearful of what might be going on. I should go back to the thing. Otto III is the grandson of Otto I. And when he became emperor, he was 3 years old. And obviously, he was under someone who took care of him. At the age of 16, he moved from Germany to Rome. Now, most people really regard the age of maturity at this time would be around 14 or 15. So they regard him as an adult here. So he moved to Rome, and he firmly believed in this idea of one emperor, one pope. But he thought if both were together in one city, they could be ruling over a united Christian world. Now remember, one of the key things of the Pope is that he's Bishop of Rome. So they decided Rome is the city. The Germans did not like it because they did not like Otto having the influence of all the Italian, lords and things that he would be living with. They just said that they would have too much influence on him. And because he was now in Germany, in Rome and not in Germany, these Italians were able to assert more influence on him, and the Germans were able to assert a lot of independence. In turn, the Italian nobles, however, did not like being in control of a German. And again, Otto was very, very strong control. This is the point where he managed to have his tutor named the Pope, and he took the name of Sylvester II. So Sylvester and Otto worked very closely to build a united Christian world. And two countries just voluntarily joined them, which was Hungary and Poland. And with the two of them joining, that almost doubled the size of the Roman Empire overnight. In 1002, Otto died at the age of 22, after having been driven from Rome by the Roman nobles. However, at this point, the concept of a firmly united Roman Empire was firmly established and firmly in the minds of people. A whole new system now began to build, and this system built between the year 850 and 1100. We call the system the feudal system. Landowners were gaining power over the people in their area. It's an interesting thing to watch the movement of power in history. The power at this time was with people who owned land. And the power, like look in the United States right now, power is with people of money. But right now, power is shifting to people who have information. So information is translating as money, but it's shifting. At times, if you go back in Europe, it was to people who were royal. Like, for instance, when you and I look at the royal family in England, we don't think there's anything that makes the Queen special over any other woman in England at all, you know? But in the ancient world, they did. They thought there was something very, very special about royalty. And so royalty was what ruled. And now, depending on the country, but it looks to me as though money is the principal ruler, and what's coming up behind it is the information thing. Because of the Viking raids, peasants began to entrust their lands or turned their land over to the local lord for protection. So the peasants would turn their land over on the condition the Lord would protect them from the Vikings. These people then became serfs. So if you gave up your land and stayed there and worked it, you became a serf. Serfs were very, very low, almost the lowest thing in their society. Emperors need to defend their lands. And in order to defend their lands, they would give large tracts of their lands to lords and nobles. And they did this in exchange for troops. So if I was a noble and I wanted land, I would take from my serfs and create an army or a troop and loan it or give it to the king. And in exchange, the emperor or king would give me this land. These nobles became known as vassals. They were vassals of the king. And a vassal is a very high position in that society. A grant of land to a vassal was known as a benefit or a fief. And vassals were required to live on their fief. And they ruled over the lives and the works of all the serfs on that particular fief. They were basically gods over that society. With the growth of this system, people again began to lose any loyalty to a central system. And the distant authorities, like the emperor or the pope, had very little influence on them. They had influence on the emperors and the lords, but very little direct influence on the people. Under this system, there were very strict rules for each level. That you find lords have rights and duties, serfs have rights and duties. The only real problem with this was the ability of the serfs to defend their rights didn't exist. They could not go to court. If they tried to go to court, they would be bribed out of existence by the lord. This system was to last about 400 years in France and 200 in England and Germany. And so this is the system we know as the feudal system. The population in Europe from 1,000 to 1,200, the population grew hugely. And at this time, trade and businesses, the idea of having sales and stuff like that, began to increase, and people were moving little by little into towns. Large part of moving into town, in the town you got the protection of being in the town, and you were independent of the vassal. And so you got out of the life of being a serf by doing this. In order to do this, you had to have some kind of a craft talent, like you were a stone cutter or a jewelry maker or a miller, blacksmith, something like that. But you had to have some kind of a talent that you sold in your store. And towns were really beginning to grow. By 1299, feudalism was in the process of changing and dying, and by 1400, it would be total and completely gone. Okay? I think we'll call it there and pick it up at the next class. Thank you very much.